I'm Dwayne Brown. Tonight on KPBS Evening Edition, footing the bill for inauguration parties. Coming up, new details on state lawmakers who used public funds for their celebrations.
The case of a young Muslim woman versus Abercrombie & Fitch is before the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm Peggy Pico with a look at workplace discrimination and workplace dress codes. Then, the science, history, and personal experience of PTSD from war correspondent and Marine veteran and author of the book, Evil Hours.
They need to see themselves reflected in the toys that they play with, as well as their family.
A special group of toys on display at Balboa Park. The handmade dolls giving us a look at the present, or rather the past, and insight into the present. KPBS Evening Edition starts right now. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. San Diego City Attorney went to court today asking a judge to release documents relating to a lawsuit filed by well-known environmental attorney Corey Briggs. The move was prompted by an iNewsSource investigation into Briggs and a potential conflict of interest. Briggs argued against releasing documents from a lawsuit in which he sued the city. He told the judge transcripts from the suit shouldn't be disclosed because the case has yet to be settled. iNewsSource reporter Brad Racino originally broke this story, and he joins us now. Brad, why does the city want these documents made public?
Because it believes they contain information about Briggs and his wife, Saricia Siki Cacciatore, and a potential conflict of interest. Cacciatore worked for Helix Environmental Planning, a company the city paid millions of dollars to conduct environmental reviews. Briggs sued the city over at least one of those reviews. City Attorney Jan Goldsmith said today he now wants a complete review of Helix's work with the city and has asked the city auditor to help. He wants more information about the role Cacciatore played in her husband's, that's Briggs's, law firm. Here's City Attorney Jan Goldsmith explaining why.
So what we have is we have an environmental planner working for a company that has been under contract with the city for 10 years to do a lot of environmental work. And that environmental planner happened to be vice president of the law firm that has sued us over 50 times.
Sued the city over 50 times. Where did the information come from about Cacciatore being vice president of her husband's firm?
Well, we obtained a memo from Goldsmith's office yesterday. It's actually a letter to Helix where the city attorney makes this claim about Cacciatore's position with the law firm. We asked him how he knows this, and he said the information came directly from Corey Briggs. He wouldn't say any more, and we know this relates to the sealed court documents because the motion filed in court refers to an iNewsSource Public Records Act request, a request I actually made asking for any information related to Cacciatore, Helix, or Briggs. The judge in the case, Joel Woolfield, said he'll decide next week whether to unseal the documents.
Stay tuned. iNewsSource reporter Brad Racino. Plans to build an abortion clinic in El Centro are moving forward. Planned Parenthood and El Centro Regional Medical Center are set to sign a key agreement with the new clinic opening in the spring. There is growing opposition, however, by religious and community leaders. Earlier this week, more than 1,000 folks showed up at a hospital board meeting hoping to stop the project from going forward. A case before the Supreme Court this week could have major implications for religious rights in the workplace. Peggy Pico breaks down the arguments.
The Supreme Court case involves a young Muslim woman who wore a hijab or head covering during a job interview at the fashion retailer Abercrombie & Fitch. Ultimately, the woman was not hired because the company said her headscarf conflicted with the company's so-called look policy. Employment law attorney Dan Eaton joins us with more on this issue. And Dan, what's the basis for this woman's lawsuit?
Well, what she is saying is, look, that the company had an obligation to accommodate her hijab and so forth because it was religiously mandated. She's been a Muslim since she was 13. What happened was the person who interviewed her assumed that it was because she was a Muslim, but it never came up in the interview. And what the company essentially is saying, if the employee doesn't say that this is something that's required for their religion, then the employer has no obligation to accommodate something of which it is not aware.
Now, this case comes from Oklahoma. California recently expanded laws to protect against religious discriminations. Specifically, what do our state laws say about religious discrimination and employees?
Well, of course, Peggy, there's this general prohibition on religious discrimination, but what California did in January of 2013 is there is a new law in effect that says, look, religious discrimination includes discriminating based on religiously compelled grooming or clothing, in this case a hijab and so forth, and the employer must accommodate it. And one way the employer cannot accommodate it is by putting them in the back, avoiding public contact. And that is the new law that makes California a little stricter when you are talking about discriminating based on this kind of thing.
What about federal laws that say that basically engage, the rights of the employer to enforce a dress code policy, let's say, versus non-discrimination rights of the employee? Where is this? How does this work out in this situation?
What's interesting, Peggy, is that under California and federal law, you can have a neutral grooming or dress policy and so on, but that is modified or limited by the obligation to accommodate for religion, where there is a conflict here, where there is a clash on what is religiously compelled and a neutral policy. The neutral policy may have to yield unless it would constitute an undue burden on the employer.
My understanding, though, is that, let's say you're doing an interview, as in this case, you cannot directly ask the candidate about their religion. So what do?
You can't, exactly. And so what the Supreme Court suggested in oral argument, they were actually very helpful, almost giving legal advice. And they said, look, what you need to do is, if you see this coming up, is explain this neutral policy, in this case the look policy, and say, just like this, do you have a policy? Do you have a problem with this policy? Hard stop. At that point, then the burden will shift to the applicant to say, yes, I have a religious problem with this particular policy.
I understand that Abercrombie & Fitch actually already changed their look policy. So why have they continued to go on with this case to the Supreme Court?
Because Abercrombie & Fitch doesn't think it did anything wrong. And the trial court realized did award $20,000. Now, that was reversed on appeal. But obviously, the EEOC was not happy. So the EEOC further appealed to the Supreme Court. And that's where we are right now. Abercrombie is essentially saying, what in the world are we supposed to do? Either you're asking us to engage in stereotyping or you're asking us to compromise our brand identity. The fact is, this woman never brought this up. What were we supposed to do? Assume, which they did, by the way. The assistant manager did assume it was for religious reason. They're saying, look, you can't force us to engage in stereotyping and we can't ask religious type questions.
Is it legal, though, to have your brand and say that, we have a no facial hair policy or we have a no head covering policy? Is that legal?
Of course it is, but it is, as they said, limited by the obligation to accommodate a religiously compelled head covering or beard and grooming standards. These are very important limitations, and the bottom line is that it puts employers in a difficult position because who has to initiate that conversation?
How could the outcome of this case affect religious rights in the workplace?
It could affect it tremendously, because what's going to happen now is you're going to be presented with an applicant, and a certain, as Justice Kagan put it, awkward conversation will have to be had. So it could have a broad effect, and it goes way beyond hijabs, and it goes way beyond this particular case. That's why it's before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't take cases that will only have one narrow impact.
Sure. Based on the first arguments yesterday, the oral arguments, when could we expect a ruling?
Well, of course, it'll be before the end of June, but the fact is the argument suggests that the EEOC is going to win this case, that they are going to rule in favor of the EEOC. There was actually some funny parts about the oral argument. Justice Alito talking about what happens when a nun walks in with a habit. Do you assume it's a fashion statement? So we will know before the end of this summer how this case comes out.
All right. Employment law attorney Dan Eaton, thank you so much.
Nice to see you, Peggy.
Good to see you.
California taxpayers helped foot the bill for several lavish parties thrown by state lawmakers. The Sacramento Bee says the Senate spent at least $28,000 to cover travel costs for Senator Kevin De Leon's inauguration. Assembly Speaker Toni Atkins spent more than $10,000 in public funds for transportation to her inauguration party here in San Diego last May. Supporters say the funds were needed for security. Others question whether lawmakers need the glitzy affairs. They were back in court today in a tug-of-war over the former Escondido Country Club golf course. A developer wants to build 430 homes on the site. He ran into problems when neighbors protested his plans, and the city council declared the site permanent open space in 2013. Today, a judge heard arguments from both sides. The question at the heart of the case, whether the city's decision to declare the site permanent open space has created inconsistencies with Escondido's general plan. That judge is expected to issue a ruling in the next 2 weeks. There's no such thing as a free lunch, right? Or at least that's what they say. KPBS reporter Matt Bowler found one secret place at San Diego State where that might not be true.
Hidden away at San Diego State, past the Love Library, through Hempner Hall, beneath Hardy Tower, stacked nearly straight up and down, overlooking Mission Valley and the 8 freeway, is San Diego State's art department. And once a week, between the noise of students and freeway traffic, a puzzling sound.
And that's about all of that I need.
That's Jim Cavolt, tending the art department vegetable garden.
The thing is we don't need a whole lot of celery because it's just going to be for the hummus.
Jim loves his garden. When I say it's his garden, I mean he takes care of it. It belongs to the whole art department, but it was all Jim's idea.
My thought was that we had these pre-built planters that had these really ugly hedges in them. They weren't doing anybody any good, so I thought it would be a great idea if we could make a garden out of it.
Jim needed permission from the university.
That was a project in and of itself.
San Diego State Facilities is in charge of where Jim wanted to put his garden. He needed their permission before he could plant his first seed.
They were very reluctant. They don't like to do things that's going to make somebody more work, which I completely understand. They also didn't want to rip out hedges that were low maintenance.
But he persisted, eventually getting a meeting with the head of facilities.
Said exactly what was going on and that I would take full responsibility for this. And they said, fair enough. And they let me do it.
Then the real hard work began.
We had to dig the roots out. They rototilled everything for us. I even got our state vehicle and tied a rope to it to pull some of the stumps out.
And the garden took off.
I started making lunches for everybody, and it kind of evolved into this thing where I use the majority of the vegetables from the garden and make food once a week for people while the semester's going on.
Jim takes over the kitchen in the art department office and plays chef for anyone that shows up.
Up to like 10 or 12 people.
And Jim cooks the whole thing.
I can see why
This week's menu, lentil soup, homemade hummus, homemade falafel, and a layered salad.
But look at the lentil soup. Smell the lentil soup. This is beautiful stuff.
The lucky dozen students and professors file in.
Why don't you guys go ahead and start eating? It truly becomes a community garden then.
And after it's all over and everyone's full, Jim smiles to himself, cleans up the kitchen, and starts to plan for next week.
Next time I make falafel, I'm going to make a bunch of it.
Matt Bowler, KPBS News.
I just wasn't sure how much.
Makes you hungry. A big celebration today for a quiet milestone. 3,000 homes near the airport are now enjoying renovations thanks to San Diego's Quieter Home program. It covers property owners who live under the flight path of San Diego's Lindbergh Field. They receive new doors and windows for free in an effort to dampen the noise. The latest home is in Bankers Hill. It was renovated with $72,000 worth of insulation. There are 12,000 more homes on the waiting list.
First of all, you have to live inside the noise-impacted area, and then you have to work with our Quieter Home staff as they identify the next area of development.
The program began in 2001. It's paid for by the FAA's through an airplane ticket tax. Post-traumatic stress disorder is the 4th most common psychiatric problem in the U.S. Peggy Pico talks with a local author about his personal experience, the science, and how PTSD has evolved.
Up to 15% of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans are said to have PTSD. Of course, war isn't the only trauma. Rape, life-threatening ordeals, and surviving disaster can also lead to the disorder. Joining me with a broad look into PTSD is former war correspondent, Marine veteran, and author of the book Evil Hours, a biography of post-traumatic stress disorders, David Morris. Welcome to Evening Edition.
Thank you for having me.
Now, even though you served in the military, you didn't actually get PTSD until you were an embedded war correspondent. What happened?
I was in a Humvee that was in southern Baghdad, and we backed up over an IED, over an improvised explosive device, which blew up the rear half of the Humvee and lit it on fire. And then subsequent to that, I was back in San Diego a week later. And then in 2009, I was in a movie theater where there was I was watching an action movie where there was a very realistically depicted IED ambush in the movie, and I basically blacked out and ran out of the theater and woke up in the hallway of the Cineplex, and that was kind of the first moment that I realized that I was kind of on the other side of something, and that I didn't have my memories under full control. But there was the one IED ambush, and there were also a number of
other ones that triggered it. But it sounds like there was a delay in you experiencing your symptoms, or at least realizing it.
Right.
Okay. In researching treatments for yourself for PTSD and for writing your book, were there certain treatment styles or options that stood out for you as being more successful than others?
Yeah, the one that at the VA San Diego that I personally found to be the most useful was one called cognitive processing therapy. And CPT, cognitive processing therapy, asks you to examine your thoughts and feelings about a particular event. So like for a lot of rape victims, there's often this thought process of, I should have fought off my attacker better. I somehow brought this on myself. Therefore, I'm a bad person. And CPT asks you to kind of look at those thought patterns and examine whether or not, and test those against the world, and ask if those are really, truly realistic thoughts that you have, or if there are other alternative ways of examining your thoughts.
Sure. You also found, though, that not necessarily retelling the story over and over was necessarily a helpful option.
Right. And the VA's number one individual psychotherapy for PTSD is one called prolonged exposure therapy. And it does work for 60% of veterans that undergo prolonged exposure therapy. A very good friend of mine who's a Battle of Fallujah veteran, PE worked really well for him. It did not work well for me, and 28% of the time there's a significant side effect profile with prolonged exposure.
Okay,
and
so
I was not warned about that, and the VA has never really come clean and admitted that there are significant side effects associated with prolonged exposure.
With that type of treatment. Let's move on with your book here. You interviewed rape survivors for this book in relationship to PTSD. What did you learn?
Well, interestingly, if you could line up all the PTSD sufferers in the world, you might think that you would see a lot of military veterans, but you would see far more female rape survivors among that group. 1 in 5 American women are going to be either raped or in an attempted sexual assault situation, and about 50%, we mentioned earlier about 12 to 15% of Iraq and Afghan veterans are going to suffer from PTSD, but rape victims, it's more about 50%. So it's much, much higher among sexual assault survivors.
And your book also includes this history and sort of this evolution of post-combat stress disorders dating back to the Civil War. Can you briefly highlight some of the terms and how that has evolved?
Well, interestingly, compared to depression is in, the Greeks dealt with it, they called it melancholia. There were really no names for what we call PTSD until roughly around the Civil War. People began, during the Civil War, they called it nostalgia, trotting heart, melancholia, soldier's heart, irritable heart.
Shell shock?
And shell shock is more associated with World War I and the British experience of World War I. And then World War II, they called it combat fatigue, combat exhaustion. But it wasn't until 1980, in the wake of the Vietnam War, after the protest movement of the 70s, that they finally recognized and institutionalized what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder.
Sure, it's fascinating, but there is some controversy surrounding it. I understand from your book that some British critics claim it doesn't exist. What is their basic argument?
Their basic argument is that PTSD is a cultural thing, and that in some ways it's an American disease, and that by repeatedly telling veterans that they will suffer from PTSD, that it's the normal response to war is PTSD, that we've undermined people's natural response, which is one of resilience and not damage. And it's important to remember, most people that go to war don't come back with PTSD. It's the relative minority, 12 to 15%.
Right. Well, there's so much more in your book, David Morris. Thank you so much. And I want to let folks know that they can meet David Morris for his book discussion at Warwick's in La Jolla tonight at 7:30.
I'm Gwen Eiffel. On the next news hour, Paul Salman on what you don't know about Social Security and how to get the benefits you've earned. That's Thursday on the PBS NewsHour.
How important is it for children to have dolls that look like them? There's an exhibit in Balboa Park offering historical insight into this question. KPBS culture reporter Angela Carone takes us behind the scenes of this exhibit of handmade black dolls, some dating back to slavery.
You look like cotton candy.
When sisters Nina and Naya play Barbies, they each choose a doll.
I liked that it had curly hair like me.
Nina is the older sister. She's 10.
We don't really give them names. They just have our names when we choose them.
Naya is 4.
Don't you like my beautiful dress?
We have a whole lot of different Barbies.
A whole lot.
Nina and Naya are of mixed race. Their mom is black, their dad white.
Ah, here it is.
Nina pulls out a light-skinned black Barbie with short, closely cropped hair. You can put a wig on it, but she says she likes the doll better without the wigs.
When she has the hair off, she kind of has the same skin color as my mom, and the same hair color and the same hair length.
Nikki and Noel Helms are the girls' parents.
We try and choose dolls that represent the people in our house, so that's why some of them have red hair and some of them are darker skinned and some of them are longer hair, shorter hair, caramel colored. There's different skin tones and different hair textures that are happening as much as we can find.
These are pajamas.
No, they're not.
Yeah, they are.
They need to see themselves reflected in the toys that they play with, as well as their family.
This is Princess Tiana.
Today, the Helms are able to find dolls of different ethnicities and colors. 10 years ago, it would have been harder. 100 years ago, practically impossible. Back then, if you wanted to give your child a black doll that wasn't an offensive, caricatured version of blackness, you had to make the doll yourself.
It's a fascinating look into our past. I think the social history of the time.
Christine Knoke is chief curator at the Mingay Museum, where 125 handmade black dolls are on view. Many date back to the 1800s. There are male and female dolls. Some are dressed in fancy clothes, others in plain dresses or work clothes. They are made with scraps of materials and cloth.
We have early seersucker, velvets, lace. There would have been remnants used, so from perhaps a sewing project, perhaps curtains, old clothing, aprons.
The doll's eyes are stitched or made with buttons. In some cases, a coconut was used for a head. Their hair is made with everything from yarn to animal fur. The materials help date the dolls, but we don't know much about who made them, says Rebecca Plant, a professor of history at UCSD.
I think in the vast majority of cases we can assume these are African American women who are making these dolls, and they're probably making these dolls for family members.
In some cases, though, the dolls could have been made by black women for the white children they took care of. Vintage photographs in the exhibit show white children holding black dolls, often lovingly. But Plant says not to read too much into that. Dolls inspire affection, but they are also props for children to dramatize the world around them.
And we have examples of that in memoirs where abolitionists would write about seeing their children or other white children play with black dolls and enacting scenes of racial violence and racial abuse. Children, they play, they reenact the social situation that they perceive. So I think we can assume that scenes of dominance were part of this play.
The dolls on view at the Mingay belong to collector Deborah Neff. She's been building her collection for 20 years. She says she's drawn to the dolls' expressiveness. They represent resourcefulness and craftsmanship against great odds. And she says they were cherished.
A child in the 19th century could very well have one doll, one toy, one possession, nothing else. So the importance of making them is, to me, really profound.
San Diegan Kara Mark recently spent a couple of hours walking through the exhibit. Her family is from the South.
It was very touching. Actually, I thought it was a little bit sad. I got a little weepy at some parts, just of all the history that's attached to the dolls.
Mark believes it's healthy for children of color to have black and brown dolls.
I think it helps with maybe a child's self-esteem, and that, they'll feel okay, that it's okay to look, the way they do, and they'll be more comfortable with themselves.
Black Dolls is on view through July 5th at the Mingay International Museum in Balboa Park. Angela Carone, KPBS News.
A late winter storm may move into our area tomorrow night. A different weather picture right now. We're looking at San Diego State from our KPBS rooftop. You see those high clouds over the campus right now. Rain is in the forecast, along with a chance for some snow in the local mountains. Winter storm watch goes into effect in the East County tomorrow afternoon. Along the coast, we're looking at temperatures back into the low 60s. 60s as well for the inland valleys over the next few days. Mountain areas looking even cooler in the 50s and 40s. And 60s and 70s with more sunshine expected in the desert. You can find tonight's stories on our website, kpbs.org/evening edition. Thanks for joining us. You have a great night.